Chapter 26. Once you and your family were back home after the last few dozen mercenaries were dealt with, you didn't hear of any more problems that were severe enough to keep you from enjoying your time once more. And after you took a moment to actually look over your siblings, it seemed to you that Cersei and Jaime for their part were having the time of their lives. For freezing as they were, they smiled nevertheless and were all in all rather unperturbed by the dangers the journey had put them through. A good sign for the future for sure, as was the fact that the king failed to send a host to reign in his greatest vassal, and as such the time flew by until you noticed one day a decline in the magic surrounding the lands of your family. A decline that you could feel was currently only affecting the Westerlands, though the effect had changed very little. You're now quite confident that your magic can, if given enough time, dispel the frost magic surrounding the continent. Not that you're planning to attempt to do such a thing for a good number of years yet, for there's nothing your family would gain from you doing so. Thus, after thinking on how the matter could benefit your house, you decide that very little needs to actually change at the moment. And that keeping up the production of your holy artifacts should do the trick just fine, for the Westerlands could use every advantage you could give them, and with how the royal fleet will do its best to cut off trade and fishing when they can finally set sail, you're sure an early harvest wouldn't be a bad thing to have. Though for what reason the remaining great houses haven't used the abundance of opportunities to loosen the grip of the crown on them is beyond you, especially with how there's a little lunatic on the throne. You can't think of a single decent reason for why they now of all times decide to remain loyal vassals of House Targaryen. You even created an easy way out, one in which they can use the prince to revitalize the realm in the future, but they all seem to prefer standing behind the madman. What a world, really. Thus, you decided to ignore the madness of the world around you once more, and instead focused on your work for the guild, which just makes simple good sense, which you can really appreciate right now. You were of course also able to appreciate being allowed to properly use your ability once more, for despite how relatively short your visit to the capital was, not being able to use your ability openly made itself felt incessantly, and you're saying that now, while hiding the details of your ability from the populace. Given the immense versatility of your ability to manipulate stone, it was always in the back of your mind, and you had to stop yourself from using it so often that the deaths you gave to those knights that were pursuing your party were a bit brutal, even by your own standards. And you guess that you had to sleep again didn't help your mental state, or the king's knights for that matter, so yeah, you were planning to indulge yourself to the fullest. Your plan, not that you would honestly call it that, was coming along nicely. And with the stockpile you left before leaving Lannisport, your artifacts were already warming the Westerlands considerably, from the castles in the mountains, to the cities in the valleys, and each village along the major trade routes. Everywhere but the coast, with the exception of Lannisport, so as to not encourage the Ironborn, who were doubtlessly looking and waiting for the first moment of better weather or even weakness to begin plundering. And you struggle for a good moment to properly refocus on your work. For if anyone would be stupid or dense enough to think they could take on your house, it would be the Ironborn, those bastards that are actually dumb enough to board the ships of their enemies in plate. Yes, that really took a moment to dismiss, but when you succeeded your speed of creating had increased quite decently, seeing as this feels more and more like a prophecy with each moment that passes by. Hence, you couldn't quite ignore the thought that you might want to free up some of the time you had planned to spend in your workshop, for something of a more martial nature. It doesn't hurt to be prepared after all. Thus, when you finished the stockpile replenishment of your guild, you left your workshop to see to the matter of the Ironborn directly, beginning with the fleet, which was mostly still fishing, and thus more vulnerable than you would like it to be. But your solutions are nevertheless a bit limited by the fact that people like to eat, and all that, so the best you could come up with stopped a bit short of satisfying. You decided that investing into the fleet, when it's outnumbered anyway, would make little sense, and that scaring off any Ironborn would be much more efficient in keeping the shore secure, and what would do that better than the symbol of House Greyjoy itself? The Kraken is bound to the god of the sea and the ruling house of the Ironborn at the same time, thus creating 8 Krakens to keep their grabby hands at bay seems more reasonable than drawing resources from your project in Lannisport and thus slowing it down, or doing the same to the assembling of your father's new army. For truly, who could argue that losing ships in your family's position wouldn't be problematic, and well, simply unacceptable, mayhaps even resulting in a need to draw upon forces from the borders to guard the coast? Yes, simply spending some of your time on the matter is clearly the better option, compared to spending actual resources, though it might become quite time-intensive, with how strong the connection will have to be. Yet you know that it's the best course of action you can currently take, especially with how screwed you would be if the Ironborn came to think they could gain artifacts here that could make their wood-starved islands warm and comfy at the ever-so-small iron price. Yeah, you prefer to see a giant kraken tearing apart ships sailing under the kraken a few times a year, over having to stop 100 raids each month. Chapter 27. Creating the krakens turned out to be quite simple despite their massive size. What actually took up your time and effort was the connection, for the sea is vast, and you have no wish to see your admittedly monstrous companions destroyed. Your work, as always, goes on at a satisfying pace in the fortified docks under the rock when you realize that your siblings were about to come down to visit you. It seems like entertaining them with their lions can distract them for only so long. Though you can't do more than guess as to what it is they want from you, perhaps they're just interested in your newest creations, which, seeing as they can't really be hidden from the troops and servants moving around the docks, doesn't seem all that far-fetched to you. With how your little boys are a giant mass of growing and shrinking black tentacles, you would certainly be intrigued as well if you weren't the one creating them. While you wait for your siblings, you also manage to finish the much easier task of adding the light patterns to the krakens, and like with your former creations, you do it with cold magma that gives off nothing but light. Already the Westerlands benefited greatly from the warmth of your artifacts, and you plan to do the opposite for your enemies, thus nothing but an eerie cold light emanated from your krakens when your siblings reached the docks. But sadly, even after all the work you put in, the castle-sized krakens made of smooth black stone, and gleaming with the dark red of the magma still left your siblings unfazed. Truly, what a bummer. It looks like you will have to put in a bit more time and effort when your visit to the camps is finished, but with Jaime and Cersei inviting you, you guess that your work won't be finished today. Your siblings were annoyingly quite fearful while moving through the camps filled with thousands of red-colored tents stretching all over the surface of the rock, but you could understand their feelings, as you now understood the reasons behind your invitation. For one, they feared getting lost, which is a lot easier for someone that can't feel the layout of the castle than one might think, and then there was the matter of your father, who they wanted to meet out of a whim. The problem being the small fact that your father is the Lord of the Rock, and thus leader and organizer of the still assembling army, which just doesn't allow the spending of time with one's children on a simple whim. Duty and all that still comes first, for it's actually kind of hard to indulge your children when they're dead. But you know that neither Cersei nor Jaime understand that fact, hence you decide to indulge them for today, seeing as you don't want to ruin their childhood with things like this. Your father, when you found him, was just like yourself, still preparing for war, and while the king has yet to successfully draw together an army for the crown, to make it a proper war, nothing but the snow and lack of gold are currently stopping him from doing so, much to the concern of your father's vassals, for they have yet to see your family's new assets and wealth. This Cold War, as the lords decided to call it, was staining the Westerlands without rhyme or reason, for the lacking knowledge of who would decide to march against their lord agitated every house that's calling the Westerlands their home. But you don't worry too much, and it seems neither does your father, with how he still indulges your siblings after a moment of reprimand. For war costs quite a lot of gold, and a certain king just lost the taxes of his richest vassal, while still having the piles of debts left behind by his ancestors that happily drain his treasury. In other words, no gold and no food equals no army, or at least no army containing the needed strength to engage House Lannister, and thus only the sea is a serious problem until a decent force will make it to the borders in some 2 or 3 years. But then a random lord that didn't rule the realm for the crown wouldn't know that, and neither would you, if you couldn't perceive the physical treasury the king has to work with, and well, while everyone and their mother knows that the kingdom is in some serious debt, no one but yourself can claim to have eyes on your father's work. And while you look for a moment at your father's little lion, you can't help but feel a decently sized bit of pride in the fact that he allows you to see his work, not that you ever had much use for the knowledge, seeing as you would be more than fine if the king would manage to properly march against your house. You think about that beautiful future a bit more, and then decide to help out your siblings when it became apparent that the time for fun has passed, and he once more intended to revert back into the Lord of the Rock persona. You did after all create something that the Lord of the Rock should at least take a look at before they're deployed, and you're sure that you won't have to hear anyone complain if the journey from the top of the rock to the docks takes a bit of time. And as it turns out, you were right with your guess, yet neither was said time spent with you and your sibling alone, for your father decided it was as good a time as any to make sure of his vassal's loyalty to the rock. It's truly such a Lannister thing to do that you're unsure just how you didn't see it coming, but you're adaptable enough to deal with it while you continued to walk behind Jaime. With how limited your time was, and how unimpressed your siblings were with your nearly finished and solidly connected boys, you decide to go the simple way and make them bigger, as in growing them from ship-eating size to fleet-eating size, which is of course forcing you to send all but one of them away, and even then a fourth of the docks was crushed by your now quite massive good boy. Chapter 28. And it seems like growing the Krakens some more was indeed the right choice to make, if the expressions around you are anything to go by, though you're happy that no ships were in the docks at the time, with how you didn't actually bother to check beforehand. That could have gone wrong quite fast. But your mind just can't be everywhere at once, and it did make for an intimidating sight, so you would say that you don't need to fix something that isn't really broken, though you suppose that even with such a mindset the docks still needed to be classified as broken. Thus you find yourself thanking the gods that you could hide your screw-up as part of the display, seeing as you could now push the blame to your father, who wanted to impress his vassals before you were ready. Well, at least there won't be any rebellions or major Ironborn raids in the future, which should outweigh the small cost of mending the current damage to the docks 1,000 times over. And while looking over the nobles observing your new creation and then your watch, you realize that it's the perfect time to gain your house control over the fleets of the West. Father, there's a problem with the little ones. Oh, and what might you be referring to as army, perhaps my destroyed docks? No, nothing like that. It's a greater problem. Out with it, Azami. They can't tell ships apart, Father. Once they're on the open sea, ships sailing under the Lion and ships sailing under the Kraken just become 25-meter-long pieces of wood to them. If it wasn't your own father you would have enjoyed his face after his comment about the docks, but he is, thus you decide to be merciful, and wink at him. Your father for his part needed only seconds to understand the meaning of your words, and you guess by his expression that he likes the thoughts now filling his mind quite a bit. Without a clear military need to justify the maintaining of one's warships, and little in the way of trade to protect, the moment is indeed perfect for a house of sufficient wealth to swoop in and buy up the fleets now being relegated to nothing more than catching fish, which well, isn't that profitable nor useful if you don't actually have the greatest city in the West to feed. Being able to augment the fleet by simply throwing gold instead of the usually so expensive favors at the lords of the Westerlands is pleasingly beneficial to the Rock's war effort. So much so that you decide to have a bit of fun, and of course not the kind that others would share. Thus you decide to send out one of your little ones to see if you couldn't make sure that the Ironborn remained in their homes for however long the realm might be split. For while you anticipate the coming wars, you weren't planning to let everyone that wants to have a try at tearing the realm apart do so freely, at least as long as there's no one properly defending it. And truly, it's not like the Ironborn need all of their 190 longships to claim their part of Westeros once the first wave of wars are finished. For now, you were simply planning to shake up the great houses, and show them just how weakened the crown truly is, not to actually fight half the continent, and thus you had to give your neighbors a little slap on the hand to keep them subdued for at least the remaining years of the winter. But then who said that you couldn't have fun while pushing the current events forward, especially in front of the facts that clearly show that the armies of the Westerlands come with the winter and all that to just over 39,000 men. Thus, you decide after a short moment of thought that investing some time into picking apart potential enemies makes indeed for a decent enough use of your time, and after looking up the numbers once more you can clearly see that there's indeed more in the way of reasons to have some fun with your creations than there is doing anything else at the moment. And so a fleet of 20 longships from House Awkward, sailing under the Kraken of House Greyjoy found itself above a giant monster deep underwater, waiting for nightfall, waiting to equally die and illuminate the sea around the fleet in red. Which you after 3 hours of waiting commanded it to do. Thus once the black depths of the ocean and the dark skies above joined together in the faint light of the moon all hell broke loose. Sailors like the Ironborn were hard to break, so your little one had to do its best from the very beginning, starting with the smashing together of 2 of the longships, and then followed up by the open display of swallowing the ship's whole a moment later. Naturally this got a better reaction than the simple red lights from the ocean, but not nearly enough. Thus after its snack was crushed 8 of its tentacles gripped 4 more of the nearest ships and dragged 3 of them into the depths of the ocean, while it was gulping down the fourth one, crew and all. Yeah, that did the trick quite decently, and after taking a moment to properly feel the reactions around your kraken, you're satisfied to see the Ironborn so desperate that they're even helping out their slaves now. But you can't let so many of them flee, that just wouldn't work, so the tentacles were moving once more, and thus 4 more ships were drawn into the depths. If only they didn't wear plate, or chains, but like everyone in this fleet they did, and thus be it captain or slave, they drowned. A clear punishment from their god, and that without discernible reason. Sometimes your nature and just what you see as entertainment actually shocks you, but you guess it also helps your family, so it should be fine. As you decide to feel the fleet once more, you see to your chagrin that they have gotten a hold of themselves once more, which again, won't do. Hence you quickly decide to use a trick that has worked decently before, namely the growing of your kraken, and so you grow it, and then you grow it some more for half an hour, and after finishing a simple thought went through your mind: screw the Iron Islands. Chapter 29. For all you know of their god, he might have actually had a hand in bringing you to this beautiful new world. With how different cultures called parts of their afterlives the Sea of Souls, it's not really that unlikely after thinking about it. But only the Ironborn truly ever cared about the plans of their god, and you aren't planning to join them in their struggle of keeping said god appeased, for while he might very well like what you currently do, you will still carry out your own plans to achieve your goals, god and man alike be damned. Thus, you quickly decide to ignore the invading thought, and focus your mind away from the so very much unbidden pain in your head, and focus on the Iron Islands instead, for leaving this rather volatile situation as is, would likely create an abundance of problems later on. You already know that the Ironborn are too corrupted with greed and arrogance to be of much use, and even the best Ironborn in existence could only ever create a simple fleet with their lack of siege weapons. The castles of their little realm were built in the days of their greatness, and thus require quite a lot more than simple ladders or grappling hooks to take. Hence the Iron Islands and its resources are now ruled by men that prefer to use what they have to maintain what they inherited. While the men with ambition and actual strength lack the resources they need to build their keeps and fleets, a situation that could surely be used to stop the Greyjoys from ever amassing all their fleets behind the king. With your mind made up, your little companion begins his journey through the Iron Islands, where he brings down castle after castle, which after 17 keeps already takes 3 days longer than you had first planned, but who could have guessed that random islands would be this fortified? All you wanted was that they focus on themselves for now, maybe a few dozen raids on some softer targets, but the distance between their holds and keeps is really getting bothersome. So much so that you drop the matter for the future, and order your kraken to return home for now. You had after all more than enough loot to loot from its belly. But then you guessed that if they truly get their act together before it's time, seeing your krakens eat whatever fleets make the Westerlands their goal should keep the coasts safe enough. You found yourself some 30 kilometers north of the rock when your kraken finally reached the shore, and presented the loot and corpses of men and ships alike. Standing before it made for quite the impression, and you realized that biting a chunk out of every fleet on the way might actually add up to a bit more damage than you had first thought. But there are some decent uses for everything, especially the tribes that supposedly live beyond the wall wouldn't mind some plate armor, even if it's a bit scratched and dented by your little one. It would make for a rather fine distraction in any case, and surely making such a gift to keep the armies of the Northern Lords north of the neck wouldn't be considered a waste of fine steel by anyone. Considering the matter more thoroughly didn't take all that much time, and you truly can't see how your father of all people would deny the usefulness of your plan, thus you would say that the steel can be removed from further considerations. This leaves you for now with a pile of 4,000 corpses, and as of now, mayhaps 6 not too thoroughly destroyed ships, all of which you can't really use. Well, you guess the lions back in the rock won't mind the frozen meat, or perhaps it could also be given away to the tribes beyond the wall. It's fascinating how many problems can be solved by giving others some of your loot. In fact, they wouldn't mind sailing on Ironborn ships either, now would they? 3 heads in one swing, you guess with a smile. Though you want a bit more than just a simple distraction for House Stark out of your gift, you want something special, even if small. What you want is the oldest stone formation these tribes of the north know of. For only the snow ever managed to truly affect your bond to stone, which, seeing as these connections to your creations are tied to their strength, needs some serious attention, and what better way to do it than getting your hands on a stone covered in said magical snow for most likely millennia. Yes, you quite like the idea of getting this all done in a single voyage, but most of the ships will have to be fixed up a bit, and will need an escort for the surely rather slow-moving fleet, meaning it won't be a matter of a quick 2-month journey or so. And while it is rather disappointing, actually having something to trade that the wildlings might want, and won't affect the war effort is a step in the right direction. If you're lucky enough, your father's men might even manage to gain some forgotten information on what's behind the snow. You don't think that your mindless little brothers and sisters would ever stop being deadly, but you never know what the world holds to screw you over, until it does, and you learned long ago to never be completely unprepared. For now, you order your little brother to wash his insides, seeing as even frozen corpses stink if you cover half a dozen fleets with them. You shrink your kraken back down to the size of his siblings and send him on his way, so that he might complete the net before the coast, and return with your knights to the rock, and on the way you decide that they're like the rock itself, quite strange and out of place, but that matter could wait until you got out of the dark snow, and had a decent bath. Chapter 30. After walking some 20 minutes, you and your knights came upon a curious sight, and you can't help but wonder why the gods couldn't wait with their plotting and interfering until after you had the chance to properly clean yourself. Before you stood something that you decide to simply call unique for now. The creature before you was a kindred spirit of a sort, a small water elemental that was flowing out from a number of small chests filled with gold. There were a total of 3 chests lying open in front of you, all in all around 9,000 gold coins of different making. As far as you could see, you would guess that just about everyone that traveled down this road before you would be outraged. But you're more annoyed with the gift, for the gold wasn't normal, and is such of little use. No, the gold in these chests was bound to the sea. It was what allowed the little elemental to form and actually exist in this world. You disliked the being in front of you before it could even fully form. Yet without being able to find much of a reason for these feelings, you decide to stay your hand. You instead thought about its existence. Who created the elemental was quite clear, as was what it could do, as it was rather self-explanatory, but what the salty god wanted from you is once more beyond you. As was why a god of all beings would create and send an elemental to work with another one, especially seeing as both of you seem to share a mutual if silent dislike for one another already. You waited a few minutes longer, thinking that perhaps the little elemental would provide a bit of knowledge, but it didn't seem like it had any such plans. The thing didn't speak nor communicate, didn't even give it a try. And that won't do, for you won't take a spirit with unclear intent into the rock, your home, neither now nor in the future, so you get rid of the little eyesore. It makes a pitiful attempt to kill you in turn once it finally understood your intentions, but the ice spikes just shatter without effect, while your own strategy of turning the ground into magma to swallow it whole was met with success. Killed off by a 7-year-old girl after being born only a few minutes prior, what an entertaining fate for a normally immortal being. You would be quite happy about your kill, if only your knights had proven resistant to magical attacks as well. But your luck, while good, wasn't quite the stuff of legends, thus you find your knight dead in the snow. Logically speaking, it was to be expected, seeing as humans aren't really made to withstand magic, but you still find yourself in a small amount of pain over the loss. How could you have known that the god of the Ironborn would be this inept, having elementals of different elements meet without actually revealing his reasoning? Did he truly expect you to take a god's be damned water elemental back home? Is stuff like this what the gods of this world see as a reasonable reward, or was he simply enraged over your kraken not fully taking apart the pride of the Ironborn? You can't make sense of why he decided to send a single brain-dead elemental, neither as a reward nor as a punishment, so you decide to ignore the matter for now, and focus on getting back to the rock instead. Your annoyance and pain soon began to fade a little, and when you reached the gates to the rock you felt fine again, though you had little in the way of patience left when some of the guards didn't recognize you. Seeing as your father would have little in the way of trouble when it came to replacing some guards, your strained mind found getting rid of the 6 guards standing between you and your home an outright awesome idea. Thus said guards choked to death on seemingly nothing. And after a proper night came out of the warmth of the castle, you could finally leave the cursed snow behind you. At least for today you had more than enough water around you, or well, that will be true after your bath. Screw the water elemental, screw the faith of the Ironborn, and screw their god twice for good measure. If what your parents told you was true, having that encounter just a month or 2 later could have given you serious problems had you gone through with sating your curiosity, and becoming closer to your knights in the process. Honestly, you know that talking to you in your dreams wouldn't work, and you understand that if the gods spoke or wrote something it would be in a language no one could understand, but a bit of effort isn't too much to ask of them, now is it? All you wanted to do was deal with the Ironborn, nothing would have required the death of your men, and truly, what god could possibly think that you of all people would let a water elemental remain alive in the heart of your family's realm? Water is more important than gold and food combined, and risking anything connected to its continued supply would be risky in the extreme, and you wouldn't take such a risk with a being exuding nothing but hostility. Death of thirst isn't how a human should die, it's like dying from falling down the steps. Thinking about the topic you can't help but wonder if your plans in the capital are still going as smoothly as they were when you left. Despite your personal setbacks, the king should have it worse. House Lannister is growing stronger by the second. The Iron Islands are by now surely ripping each other apart, and the king's madness will grow proportionally with these problems. You would pity the prince, if it wasn't his bloodline that left the realm as it is, a pitiful realm that was never meant to be united as a single nation, a fact that's now clear as day when one considers that even your father couldn't make the realm truly prosper. Always relying on his own gold and might to keep the problems of the Seven Kingdoms at bay, and even so just barely avoiding the stagnation of the realm, which just won't be good enough for the future you envision.